Romero learned early that chaos listens to competence. It started quietly, the way these things always do. A house where mood swung like loose doors in the wind. A calendar filled with appointments nobody else remembered. Conversations that dissolved unless someone stitched them back together. Romero became that stitch without ever deciding to be. He was praised for being mature, a word that sounds like a medal until you realize it's often pinned on children who never got to be children. His internal dialogue ran like a control room. If I don't check, it'll fall apart. If I don't smooth this over, someone will get hurt. If I rest now, I'll pay for it later. By adulthood, the voice no longer felt intrusive. It felt like identity. Romero worked in healthcare, one of those roles where reliability is oxygen. The unit functioned because people like him noticed what others missed. He remembered the unspoken. He anticipated the near misses. He filled gaps before they became emergencies. His supervisor, Frederick, liked to say Romero had an instinct for order. What Frederick really meant was that Romero absorbed stress the way a sponge absorbs water, silently, thoroughly, until it could not. At home, Denise relied on him in softer ways that still weighed just as much. She didn't ask directly. She sighed. She paused. She said, "You're better at this than I am." Romero heard the subtext instantly and moved into position, planning dinners, managing schedules, translating feelings into decisions. He told himself this was love. Psychologist Alice Miller wrote about the gifted child, not gifted in talent, but in sensitivity. A child who learns to read the room so well that they sacrifice their own signals to stabilize everyone else. Romero didn't know Miller's name then, but he lived her thesis every day. At work, his conscientiousness, once a quiet strength, tightened into something rigid. He double-checked charts not because protocol demanded it, but because guilt did. His empathy stretched past patience and wrapped itself around co-workers, administrators, systems. He covered shifts. He apologized for delays he didn't cause. He took responsibility for outcomes he could not control. If something goes wrong, it will be because I missed something. That thought followed him home. Denise would talk about her day, and Romero would listen with the same alert attention he used at work. He noticed micro shifts in tone, slight hesitations. He offered solutions before feelings finished forming. When she withdrew, he assumed fault. When she seemed lighter, he assumed success. Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, called this a construction of the false self, a self organized around what is required, not what is felt. The false self keeps the world running smoothly. It smiles. It performs. It survives. The true self waits, patient and muffled, like a signal buried under static. Romero's body tried to interrupt. Headaches that arrived before noon. A jaw that clenched so often it forgot how to rest. Sleep that never quite reset him. These weren't dramatic enough to matter, so he filed them away. Over-responsibility teaches you to distrust your own limits. At work, Feder began relying on Romero in ways that felt flattering until they didn't. "Can you just handle this? You're good with people. I know you'll make it work." The language was casual. The expectation was permanent. Romero's job description quietly expanded while his inner life quietly contracted. In meetings, he spoke last, if at all. He waited to see what needed filling. He became a function. When something went right, it was seamless. When something went wrong, he was already apologizing. Carl Jung warned that when a person over-identifies with their persona, the mask worn to meet the world, they lose access to vitality. Romero felt this as a dulling. Music that once moved him now played like background noise. Decisions felt heavy. He didn't dislike his job exactly. He simply no longer felt present inside it. At home, Denise mentioned wanting more support. Romero agreed instantly, already auditing himself for failures. He made lists. He optimized. He did not ask what he needed because the question felt irrelevant, almost dangerous. The internal monologue sharpened. Other people handle more than this. If you were stronger, this wouldn't feel hard. Don't make it about you. This is how empathy curdles into self-erasure. Not through cruelty, but through repetition. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday that was supposed to be ordinary. A shift change ran late. A patient needed reassessment. A coworker called out. Romero adjusted without comment, the way he always did. His vision narrowed. The room tilted just enough to notice. He steadied himself against the counter and waited for the sensation to pass. It didn't. Someone asked if he was okay. Romero smiled automatically and nodded. The smile felt like it belonged to someone else. When he finally sat down, it wasn't a collapse yet, just a warning shot. Frederick glanced at the clock, not unkindly. "Can you hold on a little longer?" he asked. Romero did. Later, alone in a quiet hallway, the thought arrived fully formed and terrifying in its clarity. If I stop working, I stop existing. Winnicott wrote that the false self can keep a person alive while making life feel unreal. Romero felt that unreality now, humming beneath his skin. He realized he could not remember the last time he had done something simply because he wanted to, that night. Denise fell asleep while he stared at the ceiling, cataloging everything he'd forgotten to fix. The world was quiet. His mind was not. Somewhere beneath the obligations, beneath the competence, something stirred, faint but insistent. Not a demand, not a crisis. A question. Who would I be if I stopped holding everything together? The question scared him more than exhaustion ever had. Romero woke to a day that should have felt ordinary, but carried the undercurrent of inevitability. At work, the unit was already teetering. A patient's vitals misread, Frederick distracted with administrative chaos. Denise caught in a personal emergency. Romero moved through the motions with the precision of habit, but his body began sending insistent messages. His heart raced, chest tight, head pounding, a perfect storm of fatigue and suppressed anxiety. The first rupture came quietly but sharply. While assisting a patient, Romero's vision blurred and he stumbled slightly. A nurse nearby, amused at seeing him falter, called out. Frederick's expression was a mixture of concern and irritation. "Romero, are you all right?" he asked. Romero managed a nod, brushing off the tremor. But the tremor was not just in his body. It was in the foundation of his identity. This was the first public sign that the machine could fail. Internal dialogue screamed in protest. If I falter, the world falls apart. If I fail, they'll blame me. Yet the body cannot be ignored. He collapsed into a chair moments later, breath shallow, hands trembling. Instead of comforting gestures, the room's atmosphere thickened with inconvenience. Tasks piled up around him. Colleagues muttered about delays. No one asked, why is this happening? Only, can someone cover for him? Romero's mind fractured under the simultaneous weight of responsibility and human limitation. This moment echoed the ideas of Alice Miller, a sensitive, gifted individual, raised to preserve the emotional equilibrium of others, now experiencing the toll of years of self-neglect. The false self cannot maintain itself indefinitely, he realized. But the real cataclysm was yet to come. After weeks of neglecting his own needs, Romero received news that would upend his carefully curated identity. The hospital announced a restructuring. Certain departments were being consolidated, and his unit was under review. He learned he would have to supervise additional staff without additional support. This was more than extra work. It was a clear signal that the world did not value him as a person, only as a function. The collapse he had endured was no longer an isolated incident. It was a prelude to institutional disregard. The cumulative stress triggered a second, life-altering event. During a hectic shift, Romero's long-suppressed hypertension surged. He experienced a sudden, intense chest pain. Paramedics rushed him out. Colleagues in shock, patients momentarily unattended. Everything he had built, every calculated act of over-responsibility, could not prevent this medical crisis. As he lay in hospital, watching machines record his heartbeat, a shocking realization settled in. The world could continue without him. Carl Jung spoke of the persona collapsing when his performance is no longer required or possible. Romero's persona, his false self, the one who held everything together, was being stripped away violently, yet liberatingly. For the first time, he confronted a terrifying truth. His existence was independent of his function. Recovery was painful, but it was also a doorway. Alone in his hospital bed, Romero reflected on decades of silent labor. Internal dialogue shifted from guilt and anticipation to questioning and curiosity. Who am I if I am not everyone's fixer? Do I exist for myself at all? These questions, once forbidden, now formed the pulse of his awareness. He began journaling, allowing thoughts to emerge without immediate judgment or action. The noise of obligation receded, replaced by a quiet but insistent clarity. He recognized that over-responsibility had eroded not only his health, but his sense of self. His empathy had become a tool, his conscientiousness a cage. The narrative of life had paused, giving him a rare space to reconnect with his true self, echoing Donald Winnicott's theory. Beneath the false self, the true self waits, patient and fragile, ready to breathe once the performative layer lifts. Romero emerged from the hospital profoundly altered. He no longer instinctively filled gaps. He no longer allowed guilt to dictate action. Relationships that relied on his overfunctioning began to drift. Denise's calls felt distant. Frederick's reliance no longer commanded him. The world he had navigated with meticulous care felt unfamiliar, almost alien. Yet for the first time, Romero felt awake in his own body, present in his own mind. He was a stranger to those around him, but in a way that felt like reclamation. Recovery did not feel like gratitude. Romero expected relief, maybe even a dramatic appreciation for being alive. Instead, what arrived was something quieter and more disorienting: distance. Not physical distance, emotional, a widening gap between who he had been and who he was becoming. Opening slowly enough to notice, quickly enough to hurt. At home, the apartment felt unfamiliar, not empty, neutral. Objects were where he remembered them, but they no longer spoke to him the same way. His phone buzzed less. When it did, the messages carried a strange tone, polite, managerial, unsure of how to reach him now that he wasn't immediately responsive. Romero noticed the first change in his body before his thoughts caught up. He slept deeper. Not longer, just deeper. His jaw unclenched without instruction. The constant background hum of vigilance, the need to scan, anticipate, prepare, had dimmed. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel like a threat. This should have felt like peace. Instead, it felt like exile. Denise tried to bridge the gap at first. She asked how he was feeling, then quickly pivoted to what needed handling. Old habits reaching for old structures. Romero listened, felt the familiar pull to organize, to fix, to absorb. And then, something new happened. He didn't move. Not out of spite, not out of calculation. The impulse simply didn't arise. Inside, there was no surge of guilt to override the pause. No urgent inner voice accusing him of abandonment. Just a calm awareness. This is not mine to carry. Donald Winnicott wrote that when the false self relaxes, the true self first appears not as confidence, but as aliveness. Romero felt that aliveness now. Not loud, not performative, but steady. He felt present in his own reactions. His emotions no longer sprinted ahead of his body to manage outcomes. At work, the change was more visible. Frederick approached him with the same language as before. "Can you take this on? You're the only one I trust with this." The words landed differently now. Romero felt them as information, not commands. He said no, briefly, respectfully, without explanation. The silence that followed was startling. Frederick blinked, recalibrated. The system hesitated. This was the moment Romero understood something essential. His over-responsibility had been structural. He wasn't just helpful, he was load-bearing. When he stepped back, the structure wobbled. Not because it was cruel, but because it had been built assuming his self-erasure. People responded the way systems always do when a silent pillar is removed. Some were confused, some irritated, some distant. A few tried to pull him back with praise, with guilt, with nostalgia. "You've changed," someone said. Romero didn't argue. Change no longer felt like an accusation. Carl Jung described individuation as a process that often looks, from the outside, like withdrawal. A person stops feeding the collective persona and begins listening inward. Romero felt this acutely. Conversations stalled where they once flowed. Jokes landed flat. Dynamics that depended on his emotional labor collapsed under their own weight. Friendships faded without confrontation. Not slammed doors, closed loops. Invitations stopped coming. Group chats quieted. When Romero didn't rush to fill the silence, others did. Or they didn't. There was grief in this. Real grief. Over-responsibility doesn't disappear without mourning. Romero mourned the version of himself who had been indispensable. He mourned the illusion that being needed meant being secure. And yet, beneath the grief, something else grew. Romero did not wake up one morning feeling complete. There was no final click, no sense that all the internal furniture had snapped neatly into place. Integration, he learned, was not an event. It was a practice, a daily, almost invisible decision to remain present instead of productive, honest instead of useful. The world did not slow down for this practice. Emails still arrived. Deadlines still hovered. People still hinted instead of asking. The difference was subtle but decisive. Romero no longer mistook urgency for importance. In the past, urgency had acted like a trigger. His nervous system would light up, adrenaline disguised as purpose. Now, urgency registered as information, nothing more. He felt it, evaluated it, and allowed it to pass if it was not his to carry. This shift revealed something unsettling. Much of what he had once rushed to fix never actually required fixing. It required tolerance, or time, or simply the courage of others to sit with their own discomfort. Romero watched people struggle without intervening and discovered that the world did not collapse. At first, this felt like negligence. Years of conditioning do not dissolve quietly. The old guilt tried new disguises. You're becoming careless. You're abandoning people. This isn't who you used to be. He listened without submission. Psychologist Carl Rogers spoke of the fully functioning person as someone who trusts their organismic experience. The body's felt sense of what is right and sustainable. Romero began to trust us again. Hunger meant eat. Fatigue meant stop. Discomfort meant pause and inquire, not override. The simplicity of this felt radical. He noticed how often he had once ignored these signals in the name of being good. Good employee, good partner, good friend, good son. Each role had come with invisible quotas, and he had met them by borrowing against himself. Now, when he felt resistance, he listened. Resistance was no longer evidence of moral failure. It was data. This recalibration changed how he moved through conversations. When someone spoke, he no longer searched for the hidden task beneath their words. He took language at face value. If a need was not named, it was not assumed, but the self that had been waiting all along. And in that allegiance, quiet and unremarkable as it seemed, his life at last belonged to him. This alone transformed his interactions. Some people became clearer, others became frustrated, a few became angry. Anger no longer terrified him. He recognized it now as a boundary being tested, not a verdict on his worth. This understanding had taken years to earn and seconds to lose. So he guarded it carefully. Romero began to notice something else as well. Without his constant overfunctioning, others revealed themselves more fully. Some stepped forward, discovering capacities they had never needed to develop. Others retreated, exposed without the cushion he had provided. This was not a judgment. It was an observation. Psychologist Murray Bowen wrote about differentiation of self, the ability to remain emotionally connected while not absorbing the emotional process of others. Romero felt himself differentiating now, separating without severing, relating without merging. The loneliness that accompanied this was real. There were evenings when the quiet pressed heavily against him, nights when the absence of obligation felt eerily similar to abandonment. In those moments, the temptation to return, to be needed, to be indispensable, rose sharply. But Romero had learned the cost of that belonging. He reminded himself that peace often feels unfamiliar to people raised inside chaos. The nervous system mistakes calm for danger when it has been trained on crisis. So he stayed. He stayed with the quiet, stayed with the discomfort of not performing, stayed with the strange dignity of being a person instead of a role. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the quiet changed texture. It became spacious rather than hollow. He began filling it not with responsibility, but with presence. He took long walks without tracking steps or productivity. He read books without minding them for insight. He rested without justifying it as recovery for future usefulness. This was not laziness. It was reclamation. Romero thought often about the version of himself that had survived by disappearing. He felt tenderness toward that self now, not pity, respect. That strategy had kept him alive. It had earned him stability in unstable systems. It had made him competent in worlds that rewarded endurance over authenticity. But strategies are not destinies. The tragedy, he realized, was not that he'd become over-responsible. The tragedy would have been never learning to stop. Occasionally, someone would say, "You seem different." Romero smiled. He no longer rushed to translate that difference into reassurance. He allowed others to experience it as they would. Curiosity, distance, relief, loss. Difference was no longer something to be corrected. It was evidence of life. The relationships that survived were quieter, less dramatic. They did not burn as brightly. They did not demand as much. They were built on mutual presence rather than mutual exhaustion. Romero learned to trust these relationships slowly. Over-responsibility teaches you that closeness requires effort. True connection teaches you that it requires honesty. He practiced saying what he felt before it calcified into resentment. He practiced asking instead of anticipating. He practiced allowing others to fail him without immediately rescuing the bond. This was the hardest part, but it was also the most freeing. One evening, months after everything had shifted, Romero caught himself laughing, fully, unexpectedly. The sound startled him. It came from somewhere deep, unguarded. There was no audience, no function, no payoff, just joy. He understood then that the true self does not announce itself with certainty. It reveals itself in moments like these, unplanned, unnecessary, alive. Romero did not become immune to responsibility. He became selective. He still showed up. He still cared. He still worked with diligence when he chose to. The difference was that responsibility now flowed from alignment, not fear. Psychologist Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response there is space, and in that space lies our freedom. Romero lived in that space now, not always gracefully, but consciously. The world continued to offer him the old bargain. Disappear for us, and we will call you good. He declined, not angrily, not loudly, simply, consistently, and without apology. Romero had learned what many never do, that being needed is not the same as being known, and being known is not the same as being loved. Love, he discovered, begins where performance ends. The life he lived now did not look impressive from the outside. It did not generate stories of sacrifice or admiration. It would not earn him medals or gratitude speeches. It earned him something quieter, integrity, and that integrity, felt in his body, reflected in his boundaries, expressed in his choices, was enough. For the first time, Romero was not living as an answer to someone else's need. He was living as himself. Extended epilogue, what remains? Romero did not wake up one morning cured of the past. What happened instead was slower, almost geological, the way pressure reshaped stone without spectacle. Days accumulated, then weeks, then the quiet realization that his inner weather had changed. The storm still came, but they no longer decided where he stood. He noticed how his mind behaved now when confronted with uncertainty. There was space between stimulus and response, a pause that once felt dangerous and now felt like freedom. In that pause, he could feel himself choosing. He learned something subtle but life-altering. Peace is not the absence of obligation, but the absence of false urgency. The world still made requests. People still struggled. Systems still leaned toward collapse. But Romero no longer mistook proximity for responsibility. He could witness suffering without fusing with it. He could offer help without offering himself as collateral. This distinction, once theoretical, now lived in his nervous system. Sometimes, the old sensations returned without warning. A sudden tightness in the chest when someone hesitated mid-sentence. A reflexive urge to step in when silence lingered too long. These moments did not mean regression. They were echoes, neural grooves carved by years of adaptation. Romero met them with patience rather than discipline. He reminded himself that reflex is not destiny. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk wrote that the body keeps the score long after the mind has moved on. Romero felt the truth of this in small ways. He stretched more. He rested when tired instead of bargaining with exhaustion. He ate without multitasking. These acts were not self-care rituals. They were signals. Each one told his body that it no longer needed to remain on alert. He noticed how his sense of time had changed. Without constant crisis management, moments expanded. Conversations were allowed to unfold without steering. Decisions could be made without rehearsing every possible outcome. He no longer lived 3 steps ahead of the present, scanning for danger disguised as disappointment. There were evenings when loneliness visited him with surprising force. Not the sharp loneliness of rejection, but the dull ache of having outgrown familiar rooms. He let it sit beside him without assigning meaning. Loneliness, he learned, does not always indicate lack. Sometimes it marks transition. Romero thought often about how many people live their entire lives inside adaptations that once saved them. Over-responsibility had been his armor. It had earned him approval, safety, even admiration. But armor, worn too long, becomes indistinguishable from the body beneath it. Removing it had felt like loss because it was a loss. He had grieved not just relationships, but a role that once made sense of the world. And yet, something extraordinary had replaced that role: authorship. He experienced his life not as a series of emergencies to be managed, but as a narrative he was finally allowed to inhabit. He began to notice the quiet dignity of ordinary choice. Saying yes because he wanted to. Saying no without rehearsing reasons. Allowing others to feel discomfort without intercepting it. These were not acts of selfishness. They were acts of trust. Trust that the world could withstand emotions without his intervention. The past still surfaced in unexpected ways. A song that once played during late-night drives home from work. A street corner where he had waited, phone in hand, ready to fix something that was never his to fix. Memory did not disappear, but it softened. It became informative rather than directive. Romero understood now that healing does not erase history. It reorganizes meaning. Where he once saw failure, he now saw intelligence. Where he once saw weakness, he now saw adaptation. Over-responsibility had not been a moral flaw. It had been a strategy, brilliant, costly, and ultimately incomplete. Psychologist Carl Rogers spoke of the fully functioning person as someone who is open to experience, grounded in their own organismic valuing process, rather than external conditions of worth. Romero felt himself moving closer to that state, not perfectly, but honestly. He trusted his internal signals now. He let them guide him without cross-examining their legitimacy. There were moments of quiet pride he never announced to anyone. The first time he left a conversation early because he was tired. The first time he let someone be disappointed without rescuing them from a feeling. The first time he admitted he did not want something and allowed that to be enough. He noticed, too, how his compassion had matured. It was no longer indiscriminate. It had direction. It had rhythm. He could choose where to place it instead of dispersing it until nothing remained. The world responded slowly. Systems always do. Some people never adjusted. Others circled back cautiously, sensing something had changed but unsure how to engage with it. Romero did not chase clarity. He let relationships reveal their nature through behavior rather than promises. What surprised him most was how little explanation was required. The life he was building did not need defending. It only needed consistency. At times, Romero wondered who he might have been if he had learned this earlier. The thought no longer carried regret. Timing, he realized, is not a moral issue. Growth happens when conditions allow it. His conditions had finally changed. He no longer evaluated his days by productivity or usefulness. He evaluated them by presence. Had he been there for himself? Had he acted from alignment rather than fear? These questions guided him more reliably than any checklist ever had. Romero still cared deeply about others. That part of him had not disappeared. What had disappeared was a belief that care must cost him his center. In quiet moments, he reflected on a truth that now felt almost simple. Being needed is not the same as being known. Being reliable is not the same as being loved. And being responsible for everything leaves no room to be responsible for oneself. The life he lived now would not impress the version of him who once measured worth by endurance. But that version no longer ran the system. What remained was a man who could sit in silence without strategizing, who could feel emotion without converting it into action, who could be kind without disappearing. Romero understood, finally, that the deepest freedom he had found was not independence from others, but allegiance to himself, not the self shaped by necessity,